This video is sponsored by Hostinger. If you're looking for a reliable and affordable web host, Hostinger has everything from shared hosting to VPSs to cloud hosting and more. Their most popular shared plan includes 100 gigabytes of SSD storage, free email hosting, an SSL certificate, Git and SSH access, and much more. Perfect for a portfolio or small business website. You can choose to pay monthly or you can pay up to 4 years in advance. Click the link in the description below and enter the code TraversyMedia to get 10% off today. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to my Angular crash course. So like with my React and Vue crash courses, this will be project-based and we'll be building the same exact task tracker application that we built with React and Vue if you watched any of those. We're going to go through a couple slides and talk a little bit about what Angular is, what it offers, and then we'll jump right into the coding. If you want to skip the slides and get right into the tutorial, feel free to do that. So what is Angular? The definition on their website is it's an application design framework and development platform for creating efficient and sophisticated single-page apps. So basically it's a front-end JavaScript framework. And like with React and Vue, it typically runs on the client, but it's often used with some kind of back-end API to create a powerful full-stack application. And you can have anything you want running on the back end. The mean stack is pretty popular, which stands for MongoDB, which is the database, Express, which is a back-end framework, Angular, which is a front-end framework, and then Node.js, which is a JavaScript runtime. But your backend could be absolutely anything. It could be Python, Django, C#, .NET, whatever you want to use. Now, I should mention that there is an older legacy AngularJS framework, or Angular 1. We're not talking about that. Angular 2 was completely rewritten and is very different than Angular 1 or AngularJS. Right now, the latest version is 11. That's what we'll be using in this video, but it's basically just an updated version of Angular 2. Okay, so 2 through 11 are the same framework, and then 1 or AngularJS is a completely separate framework. So why would you want to use Angular? What are the advantages? So you can create dynamic front-end apps and user interfaces and use it with full-stack applications. That's true for just about any front-end framework. However, Angular is much more full-featured than something like React or Vue. Not that that makes it any better, but it does include more with the core framework, such as routing, an HTTP client, services with dependency injection, and more. Since it is more full-featured, it is larger than other frameworks, and it does have a steeper learning curve. If you ask me what the most difficult framework to learn is out of Angular, React, and Vue, I would definitely say Angular. It does use TypeScript by default, which is a superset of JavaScript that includes static typing. Now, you don't have to use TypeScript. It's pretty much optional. The files do have to be .ts and not .js, but you don't have to add types to your properties and all that. We will be using some basic typing in this course, but you definitely don't have to know TypeScript to start working with Angular. Angular also uses the RxJS library, which allows us to use something called observables. And observables allow us to write really efficient asynchronous programming, and I'll explain more about that later. Angular is also very test-friendly. The CLI tool gives you everything you need to write unit tests and end-to-end tests. As far as popularity, overall, I don't think it's as popular as something like React. However, Angular is used a lot in the large enterprise business world. It's used for larger applications as it's more strict and standardized than React. As far as what you need to know before learning Angular, it's pretty much the same as with any other framework. What I would suggest you learn before React or Vue or whatever, basically just the fundamentals of JavaScript, modern JavaScript like asynchronous programming with promises, array methods like for each, map, filter, the fetch API, making HTTP requests, NPM, the Node Package Manager. So if you know that stuff, I think that you can move on to learn any framework. Now, Angular, like every other front-end framework, is component-driven. So it uses UI components, and components include the template, which is basically like the HTML, the output, the logic, which is the JavaScript or TypeScript, and then the styling. And components are completely reusable. They can be embedded into the template with an XML-like syntax or XML-like tag. And then this is kind of how a component is structured. This is from the documentation. Basically, we have a declaration here of component with a selector. This selector is what you'll use to embed the component. So basically, you would put this into a tag, and then you have your template URL, which is going to be your HTML, and you have any providers, so any services that you want to use in this particular component. And components are class-based as well. And you have a lifecycle method, or lifecycle methods, I should say, that you can use as well. And we'll get into that as we move along. So this is an example of what we're going to be building. This is the task tracker application. And on the right, I've just outlined all the UI components that we'll be creating. So we have the header, this part here, that'll be the header component. Then we have the close button, or the open and close button, which will toggle this right here, the form. This is going to be a separate component as well. Okay, and it's going to be a button component that can be reusable. Then we have our add task component here, which is this form. We have our tasks component, which is all of the tasks, and then each individual task is also its own component. And then we have the footer down below. And we will be using the router. Angular does have a router included, but we'll be adding that at the end to have a route to the About page and back to the home page. So Angular also has the concept of services. Services are distinguished from components, and they increase modularity and reusability. Breaking your code up into services will clean up your components and have them really lean, rather than putting all the functionality into your components. And services are usually built to deal with one task or one aspect of the application, such as data fetching, input validation, and so on. And obviously we're going to create our own service and look more into this later. So Angular does have a CLI, or a command line interface, that we're going to use to set up our application, and it also allows us to run a local dev server, and it also allows us to build out our static assets for production. So we can install it with npm or yarn, and then we can just generate a new app with ng new and then whatever the app name. And then when you're ready to build, you can run ng build. That'll create a dist folder, and then you can upload that to your host. And there's also commands that we can use to generate components and services, so we don't actually have to create the files and add the boilerplate. The commands will do that for us. All right, so enough with the slides. Let's go ahead and jump in and let's start to learn Angular. Okay, so this is angular.io. This is the main website where you can find the documentation. There's actually a tutorial here. If you go down here, this Tour of Heroes. And this does a lot of what we're going to be doing. It doesn't do as much, but you can kind of use this as a supplement if you want, along with this course. Now, if we go over here to get started, local setup, it'll show us how to install the Angular CLI using npm. You can also use yarn, and then how to create an application. So let's open up a terminal, and to install, you'll just do npm install -g for global, and then at Angular/CLI. Okay, I already have it installed, so I'm not going to run that, but that's what you would run to install it globally. And then you should be able to do ng new, and then whatever you want to call your app. I'm going to call it Angular-crash. Okay, so it's going to ask us if we want to enforce stricter type checking and stricter bundle budgets. I'm just going to say no for this. And then if we want to add in the router, which normally I would say yes, but I'm going to skip the router until the end, and I'll show you how to set it up manually at the end, which isn't difficult. So I'm just going to say no for now. And then I'm going to use just regular CSS. And that will set up all of our packages and all of our files and folders. All right, so we're all set up. So I'm going to cd into the directory that we just created. And then from here, I'm going to run code dot to open up Visual Studio Code. And of course, you don't have to use Visual Studio Code. You can use whatever text editor you want. And then just open up the folder in your text editor. So here you'll see we have a bunch of files and folders, but before we even look into that, I'm going to open up my integrated terminal, and I'm going to run the dev server. And you can run it from here, or you can run it from your regular terminal, but that's going to be ng serve. Okay, and that should open it up on localhost port 4200. So I'm going to go to my browser now and just go to localhost, and let's go to 4200. And that should open up the landing page, which looks like this. And this is actually a pretty helpful landing page. It shows you how to generate a new component. You would run ng generate component. We're going to do that later. If you wanted to use Angular Material, which is a UI library, it shows you how to do that, how to add PWA support, add a dependency, run and watch tests, and then build for production would be ng build. Okay, so this is just the landing page. And I'm just going to make this a little smaller. I'm going to keep this full size for now just because I want to keep the sidebar open, because with Angular you have a lot of files. When you have a component, you're going to have 4 different files for that component, so I want you to be able to see, you know, what I have open and what's available. So let's take a look at some of this. The package.json you'll see is actually pretty large compared to like React or Vue. So as far as dependencies, Angular has a bunch of different parts. There's the core, there's forms, the router, the compiler, there's some animation, so a bunch of different parts to Angular. RxJS, which is the library that gives us observables, and then dev dependencies. Of course, we have TypeScript, we have TSLint, we have some testing tools like Karma and Jasmine, so it can be a little overwhelming, but you don't really need to know, you know, what everything does here just to get started. And then for scripts, of course, ng-serve or npm start, we just ran that. That runs the dev server. ng build will build out our static assets when we're ready to deploy. Testing, linting, end-to-end testing. So quite a bit in the package.json. You also have your TS config, which I'm not really going to get into, but this is your TypeScript config if you need to change anything there. We have an angular.json, which is kind of just an overall config file where we can change like the output path. So if you don't want it to go to a folder called dist, maybe you're building a full stack app and you want it to go into the public folder, you can change it here. If you have assets or styles or scripts, you can add those in here as well, including CDNs, and those will get loaded automatically. All right, so that's the config. Now the source folder is, and then this app folder inside the source is our main application. This is where all of your components go, all of your services, whatever you create is going to go in here most likely. But before we get into that, let's just take a look down here, just directly in the source folder. There's an index.html, and this is basically the single page that's loaded, right? And there's not much here because everything gets loaded into this element, this app-root. So this is the root app component. And it works similar to React, Vue, any front-end client-side framework. It's not generating the actual HTML page or anything like that. Everything is generated with the JavaScript bundle. And there's not really much you're going to do here. We can change the title, like we can change this to task tracker and save, and then that will automatically get reloaded, and you can see the title has changed. Now, as far as the JavaScript, the main.ts, and notice that all the JavaScript, it's all TypeScript, so it's all TS extensions. Even if you don't use TypeScript at all, you just want to use TS, use that extension. Now, this is like the entry point to Angular. What this does is it imports the app module. So Angular has a concept of modules, and there's some modules we're going to be using, like the forms module, the HTTP module. You can also create your own modules, which is beyond the scope of this course. But the app module is like the main one, and that's what's getting bootstrapped. So right here, you can see bootstrap module and app module is getting passed in there. So that app module is actually this file right here. It's in the app folder, and it's app.module.ts. And this ng module you'll see is brought in from Angular Core, and in here we have declarations, imports, providers, and bootstrap. So basically, when you create a component, and you'll see right now we just have the app component, which is like our root, the root component. That's being put in declarations. When we use the CLI to generate components, it'll do this automatically. It'll import it and provide it in here, so we don't have to actually manually do that. Imports, whenever you use a module, such as the browser module, which is used to interact with the DOM, you would put in here, like when we use the forms module, HTTP, that's going to go in here. Providers, any global services that you have, global providers, and then whatever you're bootstrapping, which in our case, of course, is the root app component. All right, so that's the app.module file. Excuse me. Now you'll notice there's a lot of these app.component files, and that's because when you create a component, you're generally going to have 4 files. You're going to have the TypeScript file, which is your main class with any properties and methods and all that. Also specifies some things like your template and style sheet. Then you have your template, which is your HTML file, which this is just a bunch of crap thrown in. That's everything we're seeing right here, which we're going to get rid of in a second. You have your CSS files. You can have specific CSS files for components. Then you have your spec file for testing, which we're not going to deal with in this course. All right, so let's actually clear up everything in this app component HTML. So we'll just select everything, get rid of it. We'll put an H1. We'll just say hello world. And I guess I'll make this a little smaller. And now all that stuff is cleared up, and we just see our H1. Okay, now as far as this TypeScript file, we're importing components. So this is basically the structure for every component. You bring in a component from core, and then you have what's called a declaration, component declaration with three items in here in this object. The selector. Now the selector is whatever the tag, the HTML tag, I guess you could call it, that you're going to use to embed your component. Now since this is the root component, this is being embedded here in index.html. All the components we create will be embedding into the app component HTML. Okay, whoops. So that's the selector. The template URL is just the HTML file that you're using. In our case, for this component is right here. And then the style URLs, you can actually have more than one, but here we have just app component CSS. Okay, so those are the 3 things declared in this component declaration. Then you have your class, which is where you put any properties of the component. In this case, there's a title, and then any methods. Okay, custom methods. There's also lifecycle methods. It's kind of like React class-based components. So here we have a title just called Angular Crash. Now this isn't using TypeScript by default, but I would highly recommend that you add types to your properties and your functions. So this is a string, so we want to define it as a string. If I put number, I'm going to get an error here. And even if I save it, even though I haven't even used this in the in the template, it's still going to give me an error. It says type string is not assignable to type number. So you want to make sure you have the correct type. Okay, so we'll set that back. Now if we want to display this text in our template, we could simply, in here in the H1, use our double curly braces. So we're using something called string interpolation and show the title, and we see Angular Crash. Okay, which I'm actually going to change that to task tracker. And of course it's going to auto reload. We don't have to manually reload it. All right, now we can do other things in here in these curly braces, like let's say we could basically do any JavaScript expression. So I could say like 1 + 5, and even though these are numbers and we're doing math, it's going to interpret it to a string and output 6. I could add on to this. I could say like 2 uppercase, which is just a JavaScript method, and that will work as well. I could put a ternary in here, pretty much any JavaScript expression. Okay, and we'll get more into that a little later. Now, as far as styling goes, we have this style CSS here for any global styling, which I do have some. So I'm going to just grab that real quick, and you can copy this from the repository link in the description. But I'll just go over it real quick. We're using the Poppins font. We have a reset. We have a container that we're going to wrap around everything. Some BTN, some button classes, some form classes, and that's pretty much it. And we're going to have some specific component classes, like our header will have some specific styles, and our footer. So let's save this, and we should see a difference here with the font and the margin and so on. So I'm going to close that up. That's our global styling. And next thing, let's create a new component. So remember, we have our header, we're going to have a button component, our tasks, our footer. So let's create the header first. So I'm going to open up, or make my terminal a little bigger here. And I want my server to keep running, so I'm going to just open up a new terminal while that's running. And we're going to use the CLI and say ng generate component. And we want a header component, but I want it to be in a folder called components. So I'm going to say components/header, like that. Okay, so if we go ahead and run that, it's going to create a bunch of files for us. In components, there's a folder called header, and it has our 4 main files. Just like the root app component, it has the TS, which is the declaration and the class, the HTML, the CSS, and the spec file for testing. Now there's a couple extra things here. There's a constructor that's included. A constructor runs whenever an object is initialized, or in this case, whenever our component is initialized. But there's also this ng-on-init, which is a lifecycle method. And this is actually what you want to use most of the time when you're initializing some code. So if you want it to run, when the component loads, you would put it in here. All right. So if you wanted to make an HTTP request or something like that. Now, as far as the HTML, whenever you generate a component like we just did, it's just going to be a paragraph that says whatever the name is and then works. So let's embed this into our main app component. So our app component HTML, I'm going to get rid of this H1, and we can simply use the selector, which if we look at our header component TS file, the selector is going to always be app dash and then whatever the name. So in this case, app dash header. So we can just say app dash header. And we don't need to import it or anything like that if you're coming from React. It's just going to work. And now you'll see header work. So our header is being displayed. Now, I also just want to wrap everything in a div with the class of container. And then let's move this up in here, and that will just add the container around it. That's coming from our global styling. All right, so we can close up app component HTML, and in our app component TS, the title here, I'm actually going to cut that and I'm going to put that into the header instead of the app component. So in the header, let's go right above the constructor and let's just paste that in here, and then inside the header HTML, get rid of that, and we'll put a header tag with an H1, and then we'll have our title. And of course, your title doesn't have to be a property in your class, but why not? So now it just says task tracker. All right, now I do have some specific styles for the header, so I would go into my my header CSS file here, and I'm just going to style the header tag, and let's just display flex, because we are going to have a button. I want that to go on the side. And then let's say justify content space, I want to do space between, so that'll push the button over to the right. And then let's align items and set that to center, and margin bottom, we'll set that to 20 pixels. All right, so it's not going to look much different yet, but now I want to add a button. So if you remember, we're going to have a button that says add, and when we click that, it'll toggle the add form, which we're going to do much later. But I do want to I want the button to be a separate component in case we want to use that button component somewhere else. And just to give you an example of how to pass in data to a component and so on. So let's go down here and let's generate components/button. Okay, and that should create in components a folder called button with those same 4 files, and every component you create is basically going to look like this. Okay, just the class with the constructor and the ng-on-init. Now, as far as what I want to display here, actually let's embed it first. We're going to embed it into the header. And I know there's going to be a lot of files we're working with because it just creates so many. So that's why I'm keeping the sidebar open, and I have this open kind of wide so you can see all the different files I'm using. So I want to embed this in here. I don't have to import it or anything. I just need to use the selector, which is going to be app button. If I save that, now we see button works because that's what we have in the button HTML. Okay, so let's go to our button HTML and let's get rid of this, and let's add just an HTML button. And for now, we'll just say click like that, and yeah, we'll just do that for now. And then I want to add a class of BTN, which we have in our global classes, so it'll look like that. But I want to be able to pass in, so if we go back to where we have the component, I want to be able to pass in a color, and I want to be able to pass in the text for the button. because if we want to reuse this, we're not going to want the same text and we might want a different color. So to do that, we can, let's see, I guess we'll start here. So we'll pass in, let's say, color, and let's pass in just a static color of green, and then the text. For text, we'll say add. All right. So it's like passing in props if you're coming from React. Now the way that we grab onto these is we go into the button class, and actually we're going to bring in from Angular core, we're going to bring in something called input, because this is component input. And we just want to declare down here, say at input, and actually we need parentheses, and then whatever we want to call it. So we have text coming in, which is a string, so I'm going to type that to a string. And then we also have a color. Okay, so we just want to add those, and then we can accept those as input. And then let's go into our button HTML, and for the text, that's easy. We're just going to put that here. We can do that with our curly braces. So if we say text and I save, now you can see the text says add. All right, if I were to go back to my header and change the text to hello and save, then that will change the text. And this is reusable. I could use this anywhere. Now for the color, that's a color that we need to add as a background color for CSS. So if you want to use inline styling, you can actually use a directive called ng-style. So directives are usually going to be curly braces, and then we're going to use the ng-style directive, and we can set that, and we can set our own CSS in here. Now this is going to take some quotes around it, and then whatever the CSS style is, which is going to be background color, and then we want to set that to color. Okay, color being the data that's passed in. So if I save that, you'll see the button now changes to green. And again, I could change this to whatever, red, and that will change it. Now I want to get a little bit into events. We're not going to obviously make this function just yet because we don't even have the add component. We don't have the form to toggle, but ultimately this will toggle a form. But to add an event, let's see, so on this button here, we'll go right after the class here. And to add an event, you just add in parentheses, and then whatever the event, which is going to be a click, and then we're going to set that to a method called onClick. Okay, so it's as simple as that. Now it's going to give us an error because onClick does not exist. Now where we put this is going to be in the class. Okay, so we have our class here. I'm going to go down at the bottom and say onClick. And for now, let's just say console log. We'll just say console log add. All right, so if we go over here and open up our console and I click this, we should see add. So we have that click event going to this method. Now, obviously, we're not going to want to put the functionality in here, like the toggle or whatever, because this button, I want it to be reusable, and every button has a different purpose. So it's going to do something different on click. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in an event emitter and output the click, or output the event. So we can do this by bringing in output. Okay, just like we took input into the button, we're now outputting an event emitter. So let's go right here and let's say output, and I'm going to call this btn click. That's going to be the name of the event that we're emitting, and we want to set that equal to a new event emitter, which we also have to bring in up here, event emitter, and we're going to set that to a new event emitter, and just add our parentheses here. All right, so output, actually I forgot my parentheses here as well. And then here, instead of a console log, what we'll do is this dot and call btn click, because that's what we called it, and then we want to just call emit, like that. Okay, now it's not going to do anything because it's just emitting. Now in the header, where the app button is actually embedded, we want to go here, and whatever we called that event we're emitting, we're going to add in parentheses. So we're just firing off a custom event. Instead of click, we now have button click, which we defined, and then set it to whatever we want to happen. So if you were to add a button somewhere else, you would just put whatever function you want to run. In this case, it's going to be toggle we'll call it toggle add task, because that's what it's doing, is it's going to toggle the add task component. Okay, like that, and then we can define this in our header. So let's go to our header component, and let's go down here, and let's say toggle add task. And for now, we'll just console log here and say toggle. Okay, so if I click this, now you're going to see toggle, because it's emitting from the button. It's emitting this button click, which we have set up here as output, as an event emitter. We're emitting it. We're basically, catching it here and then firing off toggle add task, which is then getting fired off in the header. Okay, now that's all I'm going to do as far as this button for now. I just wanted to make it so it could be reusable, and we could embed, where is it? We could embed this anywhere with a custom color, custom text, and a custom function when it's clicked. All right, so we're going to leave this for now that we have our header and our button. I'm going to close all these. Now we want to start to work on our tasks. Okay, so basically we're going to have a task component. We're going to have a task item for each item. And ultimately, this is going to come from something called JSON Server, which is basically like a fake REST API that we can create and we can run locally. But for now, we're just going to put them into a file. So let's see, inside our app folder, not in the components, but in app, I'm going to create a file here, and let's call this mock-tasks.ts. And I'm just going to paste these tasks in. So I'm just exporting an array called tasks, and each one is just an object with an ID, a text value, a day, and then a reminder. So if you want to set a reminder, that'll be either true or false. All right. Now, since we're using Angular with TypeScript, we should probably create an interface for a task. So basically like a model, what fields should it contain? So what we'll do is inside the app folder, let's create a new file called task, so uppercase T, task, singular, and then .ts. And from here, we're going to create an interface, which is very similar to a class. But we want to export this so we can bring it into other files. So export interface task, and we're just going to define what we want a task to include, which we want an ID, which is going to be a number. Now the ID I'm actually going to set to be optional, so I'm going to put a question mark, because when we create, when we have our form and we add the task, it's not going to initially have an ID until we save it in JSON Server. So that's going to be optional, so we don't get any error messages. And then text is going to be a string, day is going to be a string, and reminder is going to be a Boolean. Okay, so now that we have this task interface, we can go back to our mock tasks, and let's go up here and let's import task from, and it's in the same location, so just /task. Okay, now we want to add this as a type, just like you can do string or number, you can have your interface. And we want to do task. Now we do also, since this is an array, we also want to add our brackets. If this was just a single object that was a task, we would just do that. But since it's an array, we want to do that. And now if I were to add something onto this, like, I don't know, time, and set that to 2 or something like that, you'll see I'll get an error. It says type, well, you can see what it says. It's basically telling me that it doesn't match. Object literal may only specify known properties, and time does not exist. If I wanted time to exist, I would just add it here to the interface. Okay, and that's just TypeScript. That's not really, Angular specific. But now we have these mock tasks, so let's close this up. And we're going to want to create a new component for our tasks. So let's go down here and clear this up, and we'll generate a new component called tasks. Okay, so you just want to do that. And now we should have a tasks component with our 4 files. And let's just embed this into our app component HTML. So right under the header, we know that it's going to be called app tasks. If I save that, we see tasks works. All right, so let's open up tasks and then the TS file. Let's also open up the HTML file. All right, so now we have our TS file. Now, ultimately, the tasks are going to come from our back end, which is going to be our JSON server, our fake back end, and that will come later. For now, we're just going to bring them in from that file. So let's go right here and let's import tasks. I used all uppercase, and we want to bring that in from, let's say we want to go up one level or up two levels, and then what do we call it? Mock tasks. Okay, we want to bring that in. Let's also bring our interface in, because whenever we define a task, we want to use that. So I'm going to import task from, and that's going to be up two levels and then task. Okay. Now, these tasks I want to assign as a property of our component. So right down here, let's say tasks, which has the type of task, and it's going to be an array, so we want to make sure we add the brackets, and we're just going to directly set it to tasks. Okay, so now that'll be set, and we can use this in our component. All right, so if we go to our HTML now, we should be able to basically loop over that array and then output whatever we want for each particular one. Now, I'm going to have a specific component, like I could put a div here. I could even do this real quick just to show you how we would loop over. There's a directive called ng4. So we would do asterisk ng4 and set that to, let's say, let task of tasks. Now it knows what tasks is. That's defined in our component that's being brought in from the mock file. And inside here we should be able to put like like task.text. All right, so if I save that and we take a look, you're going to see all the text for each of the three tasks that are in that file. All right, now, like I said, I want to have a specific component for a task item. I don't want to just put it in a paragraph. So I'm going to once again generate a new component. So let's do task-item. Okay, so we'll generate that. And if we look in task item, actually, you know what, let's do it here first, and then we'll go ahead and configure task item. So it's going to look like this. Instead of a paragraph, it'll be app-task-item. And same thing, we're going to just loop over it for our tasks. And then we want to pass in a property of task, which is going to be equal to that individual task for that specific iteration. Okay, and yeah, that's all we want to do for now. We don't want to put this text though in here. We don't want to put anything in here. So basically we're just looping over the tasks and passing in a prop of task that's going to be whatever that specific iteration. Okay, so this is, since we have three tasks, there'll be three of these components. All right, so now let's go into our task item component TS, and we're going to want to declare that task that's being passed in as an input, just like we did for the button, for the color, and the text, right? So up here, let's bring in input, and let's go down here, and let's add at input, and this is going to be task, and the type is going to be task, which is our interface. So we also want to bring that in. So let's import task from, and where are we at? We want to go up, what, 2 levels, and then task. All right, so now we should have access to each individual task in this component. So I'm going to save this, and now let's go to our HTML for the task item, which is what, this. And it just says task item works, so we're just seeing that 3 times. Obviously, you know, that isn't what we want, so let's get rid of this, and let's do a div with the class of task. And inside this div, we're going to have an h3, and that's going to be the text. So we have access to tasks now and to all the properties, or all the values. And then let's go under it and put a paragraph, and this will be the task.day. Let's save that. Okay, now this doesn't look very good. I do have some CSS that I want to add, and we can add that in the right in the task item component CSS. So let me just grab that real quick. Okay, so just that task class. Save that, and there we go. That looks a little better. All right, so we can close up the CSS file. Now, since we're listing these out, I do want to have a delete icon on the right here, and I'm going to be using Font Awesome. Now, we could just kind of, include the CDN, but I'm going to use a package called Angular Font Awesome. I think that's what it's called, Angular Font Awesome. I think this is it right here. Yeah, so we can install this. Let's see. We can use npm or yarn, but we should also be able to use ng-add. Since we're using Angular 11, ng-add is supported. It started being supported in version 9. So let's grab this. We don't need to specify the version. It'll give us the latest. And then let's go down here. And I'm going to clear this up, paste that in. So it's ng-add fort awesome / angular font awesome. Okay, so I'm going to choose free solid icons, free regular icons, and free brands icons. Okay, so that will install the packages that we need. If you use Yarn or NPM, you do have to install all the packages separately. And then to implement this, this is an example of a module. Okay, so we need to bring this Font Awesome module into our app.module and then add it to imports. Right, so so that's done installing. If we look at the package.json, it should have installed. Let's see. Yep, so you can see it installed all these packages for us that we need. All right, now let's go to our app.module.ts. And I should have showed you this earlier, but every component that we installed, you can see it imported, and then it added to the declarations. Oh, it even did the Font Awesome module. I didn't know it did that one automatically. But yeah, see, all this stuff was done for us because we use the CLI, and even the Font Awesome module was. So we should be good to use it. This is done. So the way that we use it is we can import a specific font like this, and then we can add it as a property. So I'm going to grab this, and let's go to our task item, TS, and we'll paste this in. Now I don't want the coffee icon. I want FA times, which is an X. So I'm going to bring in FA times, and you'll get a drop down here if you just do FA. It'll show you like all the different options here for icons, but we want times. And then just like the documentation showed us, we'll just set that as a prop here. So we'll say FA times equals FA times. And then we should be able to use that in our HTML. So let's go back there. And the way we use it is with a FA-icon tag. So we're going to go in the H3, so right after the text, we're going to do FA-icon like that, and we want to add to this. We want to bind to the icon, set that to whatever the prop is, which is FA times. So let's save that. Let's see what that does. Okay, so that worked. Now I do want it to be red, so what I'll do is I'll add an ng style, just like we did with the button. So let's say ng style, and we'll set that to, let's say, color, and we'll set that to red. Oh, I forgot my double quotes. All right, good. Now I want to start to look at services. We know how to create components, we know how to add properties, we know how to add an event, use directives like ng-style. Instead of bringing in, so in our task component, we're just bringing in mock task directly into the component, and we're setting it as the property here. So ultimately this will be coming from our back end, which will be our JSON server. But for now, let's at least create the service and bring these mock tasks into the service and then call the service function from here. Okay, so let's kind of minimize some of this stuff here. I'm going to close up everything except for this file. And to create a service, we can actually use the CLI. So let's say ng generate. We want to generate a service. And let's put this in a folder called services. And this is going to be our task service. So let's go ahead and run that. And now we should have, so in addition to components folder, we have a services folder, and then we have our task service TS. Now our service is just a class, and it does bring in this injectable, and then it has this injectable declaration, and it's being provided into the application level. Now what I want to do is take let's see, I'm going to grab both of these imports. I'm going to copy them, and we don't need to import tasks into here anymore. We are going to keep the interface. And then let's go to our service, and let's paste these in. Let's see, so it's going to be one level now though, because we're just in the services folder, so we're going up into the app folder. And let's create a method down here called getTasks. And for now, it's just going to return tasks. And as far as the type for this, so this function, it's going to be the task array. So we can just do that. And we're basically doing it the same way we did it in the component, except we want to call this get tasks from our component instead of bringing it directly in. And like I said, ultimately it's going to come from our back end. So now let's go back here, and instead of setting this to task, it's just going to be an empty array to begin with. And we want to be able to call our service method, but in order to do that, we first have to bring the service in. So I'm going to go up here and let's import, and let's say task service. That's the name of the class. We're bringing that in from, and then we're going to go up 2 levels into services and then task service. Now, in order to use a service, you have to add it as a provider into the constructor. Okay, so it as a constructor argument here. So we're going to say private, so we're only going to use it from here, and then we'll call it task service lowercase and define that as task service that we brought in, which is uppercase. So now we should be able to say this dot task service dot and then anything we have in here, such as get tasks. Where we want to call this is in the ng on init, because that fires off right away. All right, and by the way, when this void here just means that this particular function doesn't return anything. So in here, we should now be able to call this dot task service dot get tasks. And I guess, yeah, for now, we're not dealing with observables yet, so we could just set this dot tasks, which is just an empty array that we set above as a property, and then we'll set it to whatever this gives us back. And if I save that, we shouldn't see any difference. Now, usually this isn't how you're going to want to do it. You're going to want to use observables because you're usually dealing with asynchronous data if you're fetching from a server. We're just bringing a file in and setting it to that, so we can do it this way. But I want to show you how we could make this an observable, okay, instead of just the task directly. So we need to go up here and bring in, let's say, import. And we're going to bring in, and this is from the RxJS library, so from RxJS, and we're going to bring in observable, and we're going to bring in something called of. And then down here where we have our get tasks, we're going to change this. Instead of just the task as the type, it's going to be an observable, but it's going to be a task. A task as an observable. So we want to just surround that with angle brackets. Okay, now we'll get an error here because this isn't an observable. So what we can do if we want to just return an observable directly is let's create a variable called tasks, and then this is where we use of, and we'll just wrap this, and that will basically turn it into an observable, and then we can return tasks. Let's see, it's missing the following properties from task length put. Oh yeah, it's just telling us this because we're not using this as an observable. We're just using this as whatever the return value, setting it to that, and that's not how you deal with an observable. You subscribe to an observable so you can constantly watch it. So what we need to do is go back here, and where we're just setting this dot task, we don't want to do that anymore. We just want to call get tasks, which is an observable, or I shouldn't say call it, but we want to subscribe to it. So we can say dot subscribe. You can kind of think of this as like as a promise, right? When you have a promise, you do a dot then, and then you have an arrow function. This is kind of the same thing. So in here, we'll get the return value, which is tasks, and then we can do what we want with it. We're going to set this dot tasks equal to the task that we get back from the observable. So if I save that, now we get the same thing. Okay, you're not going to see any difference, but the way that it's actually working behind the scenes is different. All right, so now we're going to make this a little more real world. You're probably going to be working with some kind of backend, some kind of API, and you're going to be using the HTTP client that comes with Angular. Now, the HTTP client actually returns an observable automatically, so we don't even have to do this, this of here. It'll return an observable, and we handle it the same way. This will be the same. We subscribe to it. Now, as far as our backend, we're going to be using a little tool called JSON Server. And this is the same thing that I used in the React and the Vue crash courses. So basically, it's a full fake REST API. We don't have to write any coding. It just gives us a local backend to work with. You can't deploy this. This is not made for production. It's just made to give you a local server to work with. And basically, we create a db.json file. And let's see, yeah, so we create a JSON file. We can add different collections. So these would be looked at as different collections. We're just going to have tasks. And then we'll go ahead and run a script that'll run JSON server, watch that file, and we can make get, post, put, patch, and delete requests. And it'll actually add data, delete data, and so on. I didn't want to use JSON placeholder. This is the same developer who created this right here, JSON placeholder. This is awesome too, but you can't actually, you can make post requests, but you have to use these resources. And if you make a post request, it doesn't actually add the data, obviously, because he doesn't want public, letting the public add data, delete, and all that. So I want this to function more like a real life application and have full CRUD functionality. So the first thing we want to do is install JSON Server. So we're going to go down here and npm install JSON-server, and we don't want to you can install it globally if you want, but I'm just going to add a script to run it. Okay, and let's go to our package.json. Okay, and you should see that right here, JSON server. And then for a script, let's call this server. So this will run our backend by running JSON-server, and we want to -- watch. The file will be called db.json. That's essentially going to be our database. And then I think it runs on port 3000 by default. I'm going to change that, so I'm going to do -- port. I want it to run on 5000. All right, so we'll save that. And now let's create this db.json. So db.json is actually going to go in the root. So make sure you put it in the root. db.json. Okay, and then as far as what we're going to put in here, let me just find that file real quick. Actually, you know what? I don't have one, so we'll just have to type it out. So like I said, you can kind of have, I think I said this, but you can have collections. Like if you wanted more than just tasks, you could do that. You could set, actually this needs to be in curly braces. And make sure you use double quotes because this is JSON. But we could have a tasks array. We could have like, I don't know what else, products. Like you can have different collections, but we're just having tasks. And then let's take, you know, what we could do is grab that mock file. And I'm just going to grab these 3 tasks, copy that, and then paste that in here. Now this isn't JSON. We have to make sure we add double quotes. And let's select all the single quotes if you're using single quotes, and just change those to double quotes. And all the keys also have to have double quotes. Might have been quicker just to type it out, but it's fine. Get rid of the trailing commas. You can't have that in JSON. And let's just add the rest of the quotes here. All right, so that should be valid. So that's our db.json. Now, since we have our db.json created, we should be able to now run the server. So down here, we can say npm run server, because that's what I called it as a script. And it's going to run on localhost 5000. So we essentially have our own local API now. And even if we go to the browser here and I go to localhost 5000, well, this is going to show us the welcome page. But if we go to / and then whatever the collection, in our case tasks, there we go. So it's serving that JSON. And it's not like we can just get this. We can also make post requests to add to it and update and delete and all that. All right, so we now essentially have a back end, or at least a fake or mock back end. And even if this was a real Express back end, or I don't know, Django or whatever, you would do this stuff the same way. So let's see, now that we're going to be dealing with an API, excuse me, let's include the HTTP client. And it's just part of Angular. You know, with React or Vue, you would use the Fetch API or Axios. It doesn't have an HTTP client included. Angular does. I'm not saying that's better or worse, but it just Angular just has more with it, which also makes it, you know, harder to learn and makes it bigger. It's a bigger framework. So we want to take this from, what is it? I think it's Angular /common /HTTP, and we're going to bring in from that the HTTP client. There's a lot to this. We also want to bring in the headers so that we can create HTTP headers. Okay, so we'll bring that in. Now, in order to use this, we actually have to add this as a module. So let's go to our app. Let's see, so many friggin' files, app.module.ts, and we need to bring that in here. So just like, you know, we're using the browser module, the font awesome module, which I'm just going to bring up here with because I like to have all the modules up top, and then we have all the components. So let's go ahead and import, and this is going to be from, let's see, it's going to be from the same thing, Angular /common /HTTP, and we want to bring in from here the HTTP client module. Okay, make sure you say client module, not just HTTP client. And then we just need to add that down here in our imports. Remember, these declarations are for components. This is for modules. So HTTP client module will get added there. and that should do it. So we can save this, and now we should be able to use it. So let's go back to our service, and what I'm going to do is add a property for the URL that we're hitting, our API URL. So let's make this a private property called API URL, and we're going to set that to HTTP localhost port 5000/tasks. Okay, so that's our URL. Now, just like we had to when we brought in our service into our component, we had to put it, remember right here, we had to add it to our constructor. We have to do the same thing with the HTTP client. All right, so in our constructor here, not in the function body, but as an argument, we're going to pass in private, and we're just going to call this HTTP, set that to HTTP client, like that. So now we should be able to use this .http and then whatever methods that are available, get, post, and so on. All right, so now let's go down to get tasks. We're going to keep this here because it is going to return an observable, but we're not going to do this. Actually, we can just get rid of both lines, and let's just return this .http, and the reason it's HTTP is because that's what I called it right here. I could have called this anything, but we're going to say HTTP, and we want to make a GET request, so we're going to say .get and just pass in the API URL. Now, this red line here, it's saying type observable object is not assignable to type observable task. So right after the get here, we can just put in our angle brackets and then specify the task array. That should get rid of that. So if we save that, we should see, you know, the same exact thing, except it's now coming from our back end through an HTTP request rather than just being imported from a file. In fact, if we open up the console here, or not the console, but the DevTools, and go to the network tab and reload, we should see, let's see, right here. So tasks. So this is the request that was made. It was a 200 response. Everything was okay. If we look at the response, there it is. Okay, so we know that we're interacting with our back end. We're interacting with our server. And even if I were to change, you know, in the db.json, if I wanted to change something like, I don't know, change meeting at school to 2:30 instead of 1:30, if I save that, I do have to reload because remember, this is our server, this is our back end. If I reload, you can see that got changed to 2:30. So we know that the data is coming from the right place. Now we no longer need because like I said, the HTTP client returns an observable. We don't need tasks coming in from mock tasks. We can get rid of that. Now let's start to finish the functionality for our task. The next thing I want to do is delete. So we click this now and nothing really happens. If we go to our task item and we look at the HTML, we didn't even add an event onto this yet. So what we basically want to click this, and we want to call a service method called delete task. So let's go into this FA icon right here, and let's add a click. So when we click this, we're going to call, we'll call it onClick and save that. And it's just going to give me an error because that hasn't actually been created yet. Actually, let's call it onDelete. Call it onDelete. And then this is our task item component. So we want to go into our task item component TS file, and we want to define onDelete because that's going to get fired off. So let's say onDelete. And just to make sure this is working, we'll say not this. Let's say console log 123. And let's go ahead and open up. I'm actually going to put this down here and go to our console. Let's see, that didn't work. Click calls onDelete, and that's because I forgot parentheses. And we also want to pass in pass the task in as well, like that. And then here we have on delete, we'll say task, and let's console log that. All right, so now if I click the first one, we should see the task down here. I click the second one, we see it down here as well. Now, as far as interacting with the service and calling the delete that we're going to create there, I don't want to do it from the item itself. I want to have all of the all the functions that have to do with calling the service. I want that to be in the tasks component, which is the parent of the task item. Okay, remember, if we look at the tasks component HTML, we have the task item embedded there. So in our task item TS, so we have our on delete, we're going to emit an event called on delete task. So remember, we did this with the button. We brought in up here, it's going to be output and event emitter. And then let's add right here output. Oops, this needs to be uppercase. Output, and then this is going to be, let's call this on delete task. And this is going to be the type of event emitter and also task, which we brought in right here. So we're using the task interface, and we just want to set this to a new event emitter, like that. All right, so now down here, instead of console logging task, we're going to say this dot, and then whatever we called that event emitter, that on delete task, and then we just want to call emit, and then pass in that particular task, which is being passed in here. All right, so now we'll save that. And remember, since we have this output, this on delete task output, we have to go to the parent component HTML, which is the tasks. So right here, where we're embedding the task item, and let's put right here, actually, let's go to the end here, and we'll say on delete task. When that fires off, then we're going to call delete task, and that's going to get passed in the task. All right, so we'll go ahead and save that. So whenever that's called, now it's going to look into the tasks component, and it's going to look for a function or a method called delete task. So let's go into tasks component TS, and then from here we can create delete task, and we can interact with our service. And we're already bringing the service in here, right? We're using it here in the ng on init. So let's say delete task, and that's going to take in task with the type of task. It's just a single object. It's not the array, so we don't need the brackets. All right, and then in here, we're going to want to call the service method, which we haven't actually created yet. So let's put a pin in this for now and go to our service, and let's create a function here to delete. Okay, so we're going to go right under get, and let's say delete task, which will take in a task with the type of task. And then this is going to return an observable, and then we want to put in our angle brackets with task. You technically don't need to have like the types here. We're using TypeScript. You don't have to, but it just makes your application more robust, and it prevents for issues in the future. So it is good to do. I know it is a little annoying. A lot of people love TypeScript, but it does annoy a lot of people. I tend to only use it in larger projects, and of course in Angular, because it's already there and already all set up. So let's go ahead and make our request. Now, in order to delete a task, you make a delete request to this API, but you have to have the ID, like task/ID. So what we'll do is create, let's say, const URL, and we'll set that to a set of backticks, and then a template literal. Let's say this.api URL / and then we want the ID, which we can get from task.id. Okay, and then for our request, we're going to return this dot HTTP, and instead of get, we're saying delete, and the type will be task, and then we want to pass in that URL, which includes the ID. Okay, so now we have our delete task here, and this, again, this is going to return an observable. So the way that we're going to call this in our component here is similar to, you know, what we did up here. In fact, we could probably just copy this. So instead of get tasks, we're going to do delete tasks, and let's pass in here that specific task. And then what that is going to give us back, actually it's not, I don't think it's going to give us anything back. We don't need tasks here. However, we do want to get rid of it from the UI, right? So what we'll do is filter it out. So we'll say this dot tasks and set it to this dot tasks dot filter, and let's say for each task we want where that task.id is not equal to the task that we deleted. So that will filter it out from the UI. And this should not have an S. I don't know why I put an S. Okay, so this right here, this delete task subscribe is going to call this here. It's going to delete from the server, and then when it's done, we're going to just filter it out from the UI. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So let's see. I want to keep these 3 tasks, so let's just go into db.json, and I'll just copy this, because you can just add them from here as well. And I'll just say for, and just call this, we'll just call this test. And that should show up once I reload. Okay, and then I want to delete test, so I'm going to just click delete, and that definitely didn't work right. It did on the server side, but I must have messed something up here, and I did. This needs to be not equal, because we want to filter. Wait, I just didn't have a space in the right place. I don't know what the hell I just did, but it should be, you know, that particular iteration in the filter should not be equal to the task ID that you're deleting. All right, so let's try that again. So we'll just make this 4, doesn't really matter. Test. Okay, so now we have our test. If I click that, all right, so it first gets deleted from the server, and then when that's done, you can basically think of the subscribe here as like a .then, right? So then we're going to go ahead and filter it out from the UI. Okay, so we have our delete done. The next thing I'd like to do, which is going to be pretty similar in the way that we do the events and stuff, is I want to be able to double click and set the reminder value to just the opposite. If it's true, set it to false. If it's false, set it to true. We also want to have a, I probably should have did this earlier, but we want to have a border here, a green border, if there's a reminder set. And I believe I have a class for that in the CSS, the task item CSS. Yeah, so I have a class of reminder with a border left. So let's add that first. So we'll go to our task item component HTML, and we want to put it on this div right here. Now, since it's a conditional, like if the reminder is true, then we want that class to be set. So we're going to use a directive called ng-class. Just like we have ng-style, we have ng-class. And we're going to set that to, let's say, reminder. We're going to set the class of reminder if the task.reminder is true. So we'll save that, and you can see these two have the green line because the reminder is true. If we look at the db.json, the first two are true. If I set the second one to false, then reload, you'll see that one is false. But I'm going to set that back to true. Okay, so that takes care of the display. Now, again, I want to be able to double click and toggle that. So just like we have the on delete, we're going to have an on toggle. However, we don't want this to be on the icon. We want it to be on the div itself. So this div, let's go after the class, and the event is going to be a double click. So it's going to be dbl click, and it's all lowercase in Angular. And we're going to set that to, let's say, on toggle, and pass in the task. Okay, so now it's going to give us an error because on toggle is not defined. So we need to go to our task item TypeScript file here. And just like we did with the delete, we're going to kind of do the same thing. We're going to have an output. We'll call this on, let's call it on toggle reminder. And that's going to be an event emitter. And then just like we did with the on delete, this is going to be on toggle reminder, and we're going to emit on, I'm sorry, this is, what do we call this? On toggle. Yeah, so this will call on toggle, so call on toggle, and then this right here is on toggle reminder. Okay, so we're going to emit that. And since we're emitting that, we have to go to the parent component, HTML, which is tasks. And just like we did for on delete task, we're going to say, let's see, so on delete task, let's say on toggle reminder. And then we'll call a function called toggle reminder. Oops. Should be just toggle reminder, like that. Okay, now this toggle reminder, we're going to set this in our tasks component in the TS. So down here under delete task, let's put toggle reminder, which is going to take in a task. And then we basically just want to take the task that's passed in, we want to take the reminder, and we want to set it to the opposite of whatever it is. So just the opposite of task reminder. And just for now, let's just console log task, and we should see that change. Actually, we'll log just the reminder value. So now if we go over here and let's open up our console and double click, and we see true. Double click again, false. And you can see the border gets added as well. Now the problem is if I reload, it's going to go back to how it was because we haven't updated the server, right? We haven't called a service method to interact with JSON server. So let's go to our service, task service. So underneath delete task, let's call this update task reminder, which will take in a task, and it's going to return an observable, a task observable. And let's we can just grab this URL line right here because it does need to have the ID specified, and then let's return this.http, and this is going to be a put request because we're making an update. We're going to pass in the URL, and actually this is going to be a task. We're going to pass in the URL, we're going to pass in the task, so we're sending data, which means we want to send some headers with the content type. Now up top here, remember I brought in this HTTP headers. We could do this directly in the function, but I'm also going to be using this for the post request, so I'm just going to put it up here. I'm going to call this HTTP options. Set that to an object, and then headers, and then set that to new HTTP headers. And then in here, we can pass in an object with whatever headers we want. In this case, we want content type, and we want to set that to application/JSON. And then we can simply pass that in as a third argument down here, HTTP options. Okay, just so we're sending the content type. And then in our toggle reminder here, instead of just, console logging, we're going to, let's get rid of that. We're going to call this dot task service dot, and then it's called update task reminder, and we want to make sure that we call subscribe on that, and we shouldn't need to do anything else except pass in the task. Okay, so we'll save that, and now it should stick because it should update the server. So let's just reload this. None of these are set to true. Let's double click that. That's set to true now. I'm going to reload and it stays. Second one, double click, it stays. And you should also see it reflect in your db.json file, so you can see the second one is true right now. If I double click, it turns it to false. All right, cool. So we're almost there. Now what we need to do is have our add component. I know we haven't even created that yet, but at least we can list our tasks, we can delete them, we can toggle them. So now let's try and think of how I want to do this. I'm going to close everything up for now because we need to just create our component, our add form. So kind of clean this up a little bit. And then we're going to generate a new component. So down here, I'm going to stop the JSON server for a second, and we're going to generate a component, and we're going to call this add-task. Okay, so that'll create add task. Good. Let's open up the TypeScript file. Let's open up the HTML file. And let's see, I'll just run the server again. JSON server, run our backend. Because if the backend's not running, it's not going to show our tasks, because that's coming from there. All right, now I want to embed our add task into, we're actually going to embed it into the tasks component, because the task component is going to be connected to a route later on, and we want both the add form and the actual task to show. So let's go into task component HTML, and let's go up right above the app task item, and let's add app add task. We save that. We should now see this add task works. Okay, so we'll close that up, and let's see, I guess trying to think of where to start here. If I want to do the HTML, let's just add the form first, the HTML. So we'll go to our HTML here. Let's get rid of this, and let's add a form. We don't want an action, and we're going to have a class of form-control, and then we'll have a label for this is going to be the text. So we'll say label for text, and for the title, though, we'll say task. And then let's have an input, and this will be the type of text. We'll give it a name of text and an ID of text and a placeholder of add task. And just to see what that looks like, okay, and it's styled nicely because of because of the CSS, the global CSS for form control and all that. Then we have the day and time, so I'm going to copy this whole form control down, and this is going to be for, let's say, day. Change this to, say, day and time, and the input type will be text, the name will be day, the ID day, and then we'll say add day and time. All right, good. And then the last thing, or the last input, is going to be the set reminder checkbox. So for that, let's put, I guess, just copy this. So in addition to form control, there's a class form control check, dash check. And let's see, label, say reminder, set reminder, and the type is going to be a checkbox. and the name, reminder, ID, reminder, and no placeholder. It's a checkbox. Okay, let's see what that looks like. What? Form controls. Oh, I'm missing a double quote. All right, so there's our checkbox, good. And then the last thing is an input button. So let's say input, I'm gonna give it a type of submit. And let's see, value, we'll say save task. And I'm gonna give it a class of BTN and BTN block. And oh, this is really close right here. I think I had a class of like add or something like that. Let me just check the global style sheet real quick. Yeah, I have this add form with margin bottom. That can actually go in the style sheet for the component because that's not going to be used anywhere else. So right in the CSS here, paste in add form, and let's add that to the form class, add dash form. Okay, so that'll push it down. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now, when you're working with forms, you're going to want to put in your class, in the component class, a property for each field. So in our case, we have text, a text field, a day field, and a reminder. So let's add those as properties here. So we'll say text, which is going to be a string, day, which is a string, and reminder, which is a Boolean, and I'm going to set that to false by default because you can set default values. Now, I want to basically create a two-way data binding between this property and the input. Now, in order to do that, we need to use a directive called ngModel. However, that's part of the forms module, which isn't set up by default. So we do have to just go to app.module.ts, and we want to bring in the forms module. So let's go right under the HTTP client module, and let's import from here. Let's say forms module, and that's going to be from Angular/forms. And then of course we have to just add it down here. Since it's a module, it's going to go in the imports. So right here, forms module. So now we have our text, day, and reminder properties here. So let's go to the form now, and on the first input, I'll go right after the name, and we're going to be using, it's a two-way data binding, so we use brackets, and because brackets are for input, right? Like if you are binding something, and then events are output, which are parentheses. This is a two-way data binding, so we actually use both. And then the ngModel directive, and set it to text because that's we want to bind it to this right here, to text. All right, and then we want to do the same for the others. So let's see, I'll just copy that. And I believe your name, you have to have a name attribute with the same value. All right, so this would be day, and then this would be reminder. All right. And if I were to put out, like, let's say I wanted to have under this div, I wanted to output text, which is just nothing by default. If I start to type in here, you'll see that it'll output here. So it's a two-way binding. Okay, just wanted to show you that. So the next thing we want to do is have a submit, and there's actually, if we go to the form here, there's actually an ng submit event that we can use. So we can use parentheses and then ng submit. And by doing this, we don't have to do like, usually have to do the event.prevent default to prevent the form from submitting. We don't have to do that with ng submit, which is nice. So we'll set that to a function called onSubmit. And that doesn't exist, so let's go to add task and let's create onSubmit. Okay. Now for on submit, we're going to want to, let's just do some quick validation. Remember, we can access this stuff up here with this dot text, this dot day, and so on. So I just want to make sure that the text is there. So I'll say if not this dot text, then let's do an alert, and we'll say please add a task, and then we'll return. All right, so if we were to submit this without a task, we get a little alert, just some basic validation. If it is, then let's create an object here called new task, and let's set text to this dot text. We'll set day to this dot day, and we'll set reminder to this dot reminder. Okay, so we have this object, and this is what we want to submit to our server through our service. Now we're not going to do that here in the add task component. We're going to do it in the parent component, which is task, just like where we did everything else. So we're going to have to emit an event here. All right, I'll do that in a second. Let's just say to do emit event. I just want to clear the form after. So let's say this dot text, set that to just an empty string. And we'll do the same with this dot day. And then the reminder, I want to set that to false. Okay, so if I were to submit, it's not going to do anything, but it should clear. So now to emit the event, remember we have to bring in up here, let's bring in output and the event emitter. And then let's set, actually put this up above here, let's set the output, and we'll call this on add task. And this is going to be an event emitter task, and we'll set that equal to a new event emitter. Okay, and then down here we can emit it. What's this? Did I not bring in? No, I didn't bring in the interface of task, so let's import task from dot dot slash task. And then right here, let's emit it. So we'll say this dot on add task dot emit, and we want to emit it with the new task, which is this object that we created based on the form inputs. All right, so now since we have this on add task emitting, we have to go to the parent component, which is tasks, go to the HTML, just like we did with like the delete and all that. Grab that, and let's go ahead and paste that in and change this to on add task. And then we'll call a function, whoops, we'll call a function called add task. Now this doesn't exist. We were able to use task here because of our ng4, because of our loop we had access to the task. But what we can do is just pass in money sign event, and we should be able to then get the task through that. Okay, now it's just telling us add task does not exist on the task component, so let's go to the TS file, and from here let's put this down below, add task, and let's just make sure that works. So I'll just console log task for now, and then we'll open up our console, and I should be able to just type some crap in here and save, and you'll see that it'll log. Okay, so obviously we want it to do more than log. We want it to get added to our back end. So we need to make a request through our service, just like we did with these other things. So let's go to our service now. Let's see, are we done here? I think we're done with the HTML here and done with that. So let's go to our service, our task service. And the last thing we want to do here is add task. Okay, and then this is going to return an observable task. Okay, and let's, from here, we're just going to return this dot HTTP, and we're going to make a post request. And we want to pass in here the API URL. We want to pass in the task, and we also want to pass in the HTTP options, which has the header, okay, because we are submitting data. And that will return an observable. So let's go back to the task component where we have our add task, and let's we could probably just copy this. So we'll say this task service, and we want to call add task, pass in that specific task, and then we'll get back a single task. So just make that singular. And then what we want to do is not this, but we want to set let's say this dot task, and then we want to push onto that the task that we get back. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'll just say test task, and I don't know, May 7th, set reminder and save. Okay, so it gets added. Good. Let's reload, and it's still there, meaning that it communicated with the server, made the request. Good. If I double click, I can toggle it, I can delete it. All right, so we basically have CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. I know the update is only the reminder, like we don't have the ability to change the title or the text or the day. You can add that if you want. This is getting way longer than I thought it would be, but we need to finish up by adding functionality to this button right here. I don't want this to show by default. I want just the task to show, and then you click add, then this shows, then this turns into a close button so you can close it and just toggle this. So we need to do that, and then we're also I'm gonna show you how to implement routing as well, which is pretty easy. So let's handle the toggle. I'm gonna just close up all of this and just collapse the stuff here. Now, let's think about what we have to do here. We have to be able to click this button and make this component not show, right? If we click it again, then it'll show. Not only that, but I want the button to change. I want this to turn red and have the text close. Now, since we want something to happen in multiple components, instead of just passing things around, passing basically, like in React, it's called prop drilling. Instead of doing that, we're going to create a UI service with a property called show add task, meaning show this add task component. That'll be a Boolean, and we're going to set up something called a subject, which is a certain type of observable. Actually, let me bring this article over real quick just to show you a use case for subjects. So where is it? We'll get into more detail later, but for now it's enough to know that a subject involves taking the notifications from a single source observable and forwarding them to one or more destination observers. So basically we want a subject when we click this, and we want to track it both here in the button, or in the header rather, and then also in the add task component. So let's create a new service. Right now we just have our task service. I'm going to stop JSON server for a second here, and let's see, I should have my other so ng generate service, and then services, and we'll call this UI. Okay, we'll go ahead and start our server back up, and let's open up our UI service. So we're going to bring in, let's say import, we're going to bring in observable and then subject, and we're going to bring that in from RxJS. And then let's go down into our service class, and basically we're going to define, let's see, private show add task, which is going to represent if it's shown or not. So that's going to be a Boolean, and we're going to set that to false by default. And then we want to define a subject, so we'll say private subject, set that to a new subject. And this is all in the documentation. And we're going to use any for the type. And then what we want to do is create, we want to create a function to toggle that value, this show add task. So let's say toggle add task. And this isn't going to return anything, so I'm going to set this to void. And then we're just going to say this dot show add task, meaning that value we set above, which is false by default, and set it to whatever the opposite. So not this dot show add task. And then we want to take this dot subject, and there's a method called next, and then we can pass in the value, which is going to be whatever the current show add task. If it gets set to true, true will get passed in. If it's false, false will get passed in. Now the other method that we want is basically going to fire off when we toggle, right? So we're going to call this on toggle. And this is going to be an observable. And for the type, we'll say any. And then we want to return from this dot subject and return as observable. And that's it. That should be it for our service. So basically we want to call this when we actually click it, and then wherever we want to do something when that happens, we want to subscribe to on toggle. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now let's go to, let's see. So just to refresh my memory a little bit, we have our button. When we click it, we call on click. And if we look in the button here, we're emitting button click from the component, which then is in the header, right? So in the header TS, okay, we didn't add button click yet, but if we look at the HTML, yeah, button click, oh yeah, we called toggle add class. Okay, so toggle add class is what's being fired off, and right now, yeah, so it's just console logging. So in this header component, this is where we're going to bring in our UI service. So let's say import UI service from, and it's going to be up 2 levels in services / UI.service. And then we also want to bring in from RxJS something called subscription. So let's import subscription from RxJS. And let's see, so we have our title. Let's add a value of show add task, which is going to be a Boolean. And let's have our subscription, which is going to be subscription. Now remember, in order to use a service, you have to add it to your constructor. So in here, we're going to say private, and we'll call this lowercase UI service, and then uppercase UI service, which is what we brought in. So now we should be able to say this dot UI service dot, and then any methods that are in there. What is that? All right, now in the toggle add task, instead of this, let's say this dot UI service, and then toggle add task. Okay, so basically when we click that, we're calling, in our service, we're calling this right here. Okay, if I click it, I mean, we're not responding to it, but this should be getting called. In fact, if I just console log like 1, 2, 3, and I click it, we should see that 1, 2, 3. Now we want to handle, whatever we want to happen when we actually click that. And one of the things we want to happen is change this show add task value right here. Okay, this is just a local property to this class or to this component. But I do want to change it so that I can then change the text and the color that is going into the button right here instead of just having green. Actually, you know what? Let's add it. I'm going to wrap this in. Actually, can I do? I think I can do this. So like show add task. If that's true, then I'm going to want this to be red. Right? So let's say red, else then I want this to be green. And I think I need quotes around that. Nope, that didn't work. Let's see what. Oh, I have. You need double curly braces. Too many switching of frameworks. So now if I click this, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen just yet. But if I set this show add task manually, if I set it to true, you'll see that turns red. All right. Not only do I want it to turn red, but I want the text to be different. So let's actually just copy this. And for the text, if it's shown, then I want it to say close. And if it's not, then I want it to say add. Okay, so now you'll see it's red and it says close. If I change this to false. Okay. Now we could, of course, just change that in here, but we want to also catch that change in the add component itself so we can display and not display this. So what we'll do is once this is fired off, this toggle add task in our service, if we want to basically watch that, we need to use the subscription that we brought in. And that's going to happen in the constructor, in the body. So in the constructor, let's say this dot subscription. So we're just setting up a subscription to the toggle. So this, set that to this dot UI service. Whoops. UI service dot I think on toggle, is that what I called it? So in the UI service, yeah, right here. So we want to call that on toggle. So on toggle, and that's going to be an observable. So just like with our other observables, we're going to call subscribe, and we're going to get a value back, and that's going to be either the true or false. Okay, and this is going to be an arrow function, and then we'll say this dot show add task. We're going to set it to whatever that value is. Okay, and remember that value is just going to be the opposite of whatever show add task is in here. It's false by default. It changes to true. It's passed in here in this dot subject next, and then we're catching it here. So true or false, and then we're setting this component or this class property to whatever that is. All right, so let's click it, and you can see now we're toggling the button. Okay, so we essentially want to do this same thing in the add component as well, so we can show or not show the form. So let's do that. Let's go to, we can close that up, close the service up, the header up, and let's go into add task. Okay, we're going to go into here, and we want to bring in the UI service here as well. So we want to import UI service from services / UI service, and to use that we have to pass it into the constructor. So private UI service. All right, and then just like we did with the other component with the header, we're going to have a show add task, which is going to be a Boolean. And let's see, we're going to basically just do the same thing that we did in the other component. Actually, I could just copy it. So from the header in the constructor, what we did right here, let's grab that, paste that in. So now any, oh, we have to do the subscription as well. So let's make sure we import subscription from, that's going to be from RxJS. And let's set a subscription and set that subscription. Okay, so those steps that I just did are basically what you're going to want to do if you wanted anything else in any other component to respond to this click right here, to that toggle. Okay, if you want anything to respond to that. And then when that happens, this show add task is going to be set to whatever, whatever it's set to through the service. So now to deal with that, let's go to the HTML for the add task component. And we just want to show it if, if it's true and not show it if it's false. So we can use an ngIf. And if you want to use an ngIf just on a regular element like this, use asterisk ngIf, and we'll set that to show add task. Okay, so now it's not shown. If I click add, not only does the button change, but it also now displays the form, and I can toggle that. So I didn't have to like pass around values or pass around events or anything. We just have a service, a UI service, that we could definitely put other stuff in here. If we had if we added stuff to the UI and we wanted to respond to specific events in multiple components, we could put it in here. All right, so now that we can do that, we can add, I think the only thing really left to do is to implement the router. And just to make sure this still works, I don't know why it wouldn't, but we'll go ahead and try it. Okay, double click, delete. All right, so all this stuff seems to work. We can't add it without a title. Close. So now for the router, let's close both of these up. Okay. Now at the beginning, you remember when we used the CLI, it asked us if we wanted to use the router. So normally I would have said yes, most likely, but I wanted to show you how to just build just the single UI here with no other routes or anything, and then show you how to implement it manually, which isn't hard at all, really. We just need to go to our app.module, which is right here. Okay, and we want to bring in the router module, and then we can set up our routes. And what we'll do is we'll create a footer component that has a link to an about page or an about route. So let's go under the forms module and let's import from here. And this stuff I'm doing right now would happen automatically if you chose yes in the beginning. So we're going to bring in router module and routes, and that's going to be from Angular/router. And then we have to add, actually let's create our routes first. So we'll go right above ng module here and say const app routes, and we're going to set, that's going to have a type of routes, and then we're going to set that to an array with objects with a path. Now for the home page, you're going to just have just an empty string. So for the index, I should say, the index route, and then I want to connect that to the component of tasks component, which has both the add form and the list of tasks, right? And then I guess that's all I'll do for now. And then we want to go down to the imports, and after the forms module, we want to add router module, but we also want to do this dot for route. And inside here, we pass in our app routes. And you can put your app routes in a separate file as well if you'd like. And if you want to debug, you could add some options here, and you could do like enable tracing and set that to true. That can help you debug your routes. Now, in order for your, whatever route you're on for that component to show, you just want to go to your main app component, to the HTML, and instead of like app tasks, what we want to put here is our router-outlet, like that. If I save that, I should see the same thing because our tasks component is our home page. right? Now, if I create another route, or I should say, let's create another component called about. So I'm going to just stop this for a second, and let's generate a new component called about. And you could put this in like a subfolder called pages if you wanted to, because it's kind of like a page. But let's create that, and we'll run the server again. And then let's go into about, and let's go into the about HTML. And this is, I mean, you can put whatever you want here, but I'm just going to have a div with an h4. Actually, let's put an h2. Let's put an h2 here, and task tracker version. And then I want a link to go back. Now, with the Angular router, what you do is it's an A tag, but you don't want to use href because that'll refresh the page like a regular link. You want to use router link like this. So a router link, and this is going to go to /, and we'll just say go back. All right, so that's our about component. Now what we want to do is go back into app module. About component should have been already brought in because we use the CLI, but we want to add it to the routes. So we have our first route here. Now let's just copy this down, and let's set this to the about component, and this is going to be about. If I save that now, and I go to my URL bar here and to /about, it shows me the about page. Okay, and it still shows the header and all that, because if we look in our main app component, we have our container, we have our header, and then whatever the specific route is going to output here. Now I do want a footer component as well that has a link to that about page, so let's generate that real quick. And let's see, so footer, I think I have a little bit of CSS for this. Yeah, we're just going to put some margin, text align center, and then for the HTML for the footer, let's just do this. So just a copyright and then a link to the about page. And then we want to embed that in our main app component. So that'll be app-footer. Okay, so now we have a footer that takes us to the about page, and we can go back. So now we're switching between routes. All right. Now one last thing. If I go to the about page, I don't want the button to show up here. This is stupid. There's no point in having this here. So let's limit that to, we'll limit the button to the home page. So to do that, let's go to our header. Okay, so the app button is being displayed right here. I'm trying to think of, yeah, so in order to do this, we need to bring in the router. So in our header TS, let's go up here and let's import, because we just need to figure out what route we're on, and we can do that with the router. So that's going to be from Angular/router. And since we brought that in here, we have to bring it in here as a provider into our constructor. So we just want to put a comma here. You can put as many providers as you want. And let's say private router lowercase, set that to router uppercase. And then we should have access to this.router, which has a URL property. So I'm going to create a function here that says call it hasRoute. And that's going to take in a route, which will be a string. And all I want to do here is just return and say this.router.url if that is equal to route. So that'll be a true or false value. Okay, and then we're going to go into the header component HTML, and where we have our app button, let's add an ng if onto this. So ngIf, and we're just going to set that to has route, and the route is just slash because it's the index. So basically we only want to show this on the index page, which is our tasks page, right? Because that's the route we set it to. So let's reload this and let's hit about, and now you'll see that that button does not show here, and it won't show on any route except for the index route, which is this tasks page. Okay, so that's it. Now, if you're coming from React or Vue, you might notice that this is more difficult, right? It's just, I think it's pretty objective. I don't really think it's just an opinion that Angular is harder than those other two frameworks. And that's because there's just more to it. It's more strict, and it's just more robust. And I think that that's a big reason why it's so popular in the big business world. If you have a startup or your own project or you're freelancing, Angular might not be the best choice. I mean, for me, my favorite framework is React, followed by Vue, followed by Angular. But I don't build a lot of really large-scale applications. If I was, then I would probably look at Angular because there's just so much to it, and things are just so much more strict, and organized, I guess, than with React or Vue, where you can do things just pretty much any way you'd like. Angular has a very specific way of doing things. But with that said, it is a great framework. It's just has a bit of a learning curve, and obviously this is the longest. It's the same exact application that I built in React and Vue, and it took at least a half hour, maybe 45 minutes longer than those videos did. But hopefully you enjoyed it, guys, and hopefully it was understandable. Again, refer to the documentation for anything you didn't understand, and that's it. I will see you next time.